Hey everybody, it's Mr. Rob. So here we go with Foundations of Government. This is your Thursday lecture. So if I were to ask you why we have government, hopefully you can give me a more informed answer than you could have, say, before you came to class or to civics in general. Because it's not just because you need somebody to tell us what to do. If you think about the political philosophers, they gave us an actual answer why we have government. And you should be able to tell me that it involves the state of nature, that it involves the social contract, and you should be able to distinguish the difference between, say, Locke, and Hobbes's view of the state of nature, and also what the social contract is going to produce in terms of government. Okay? Thomas Hobbes. So he wrote in the Leviathan about the state of nature. And the state of nature is that thing, that period, which existed before we had society or governments. And Hobbes believes that everybody was born equally in terms of both body and mind. And that people were constantly in a state of war, where it was everybody against everybody. And that there was no law present, there was no property. And as he wrote in Leviathan, there were no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worse of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. In the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short. So, to go from a state of nature to society or government, Hobbes believed that people they came together voluntarily, and through a social contract, they laid the foundations of government. Meaning, it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal constitution, but it's the agreed upon rules of who gets to rule and what they get to do. So people come to this willingly, okay, and they give up some of their individual rights. So Hobbes does believe people have rights to establish a legitimate state, and it's controlled by a sovereign that makes laws and keeps the order. And for Hobbes, that sovereign is going to be an absolute monarch. So he doesn't want to have any limits on government, such as the separation of powers. So he wants a king which acts as both executive and legislative. And judicial as well. So Locke is the counter to Hobbes. Like Hobbes, Locke does believe that there's a state of nature and that, men can be selfish. And Locke is going to differ, though, from Hobbes in that he believes that in the state of nature, everybody is equal and independent and has a natural right to life, liberty, and property. Locke, like Hobbes, he viewed the social contract as being also essential to having a legitimate government. The difference here, though, is that for Locke, power comes from the consent of the governed, and if they don't continue to give their consent, then that means that that government is no longer legitimate. That was not how Hobbes viewed it. For Hobbes, it was a one-time deal. You agree to it, and you're stuck with it for life. Locke is not as strict in his interpretation of that. Locke is for limits of government. For example, he does agree with the separation of powers. He does believe that revolution is something that, if it is required, because the tyrannical government is not adhering to upholding people's rights, then it should be overthrown. So Hobbes and Locke, some areas that they agree on, they both believe that people have rights and they're natural rights. They believe that there is a state of nature and that, in that state, it's not very conducive for human beings. Definitely Hobbes thinks of it worse than, say, Locke does. A social contract is necessary in both men's view in order to have the foundation or the formation of a legitimate government. They do disagree, though, in some areas, such as Hobbes didn't include property as one of his natural rights. They both have a slightly different view of human nature. It's up here. You can read it. I'm not going to test you on it, but it's kind of an interesting way to look at how these men thought about people, and it sort of informs how they thought they should be ruled. And then they have differing views on social contract limits. So Hobbes, he saw the social contract as limitless. So, even if the king becomes a tyrant, that does not give the people who agreed to the social contract to overthrow that government. Where Locke sees it the exact opposite. Locke views it as If the government in power, which you have given power, is misusing that power by not protecting your rights, then you have a responsibility to overthrow and replace that government. So the sovereign state, this is the new stuff. So make sure that you're getting this stuff down in your notes. So the state. A state is defined as a body of people living in a defined space with the power to make and enforce laws and with an organization to do it. All right, so let's take this and then unpack it. So you take a state. It has to have a population. That population can be rural or urban or suburban. It can be wealthy. It can be poor or middle class. It can be educated or lack education. If it's going to be successful, it probably should have some cultural traditions that it shares, but the United States is a very multicultural nation, and then it should have a common language. Now, English is definitely not the official language of the United States because there is no official language of the United States, but it is the common language that we share. Just like if I go back up here to D, cultural traditions, the United States is often thought of as a Christian nation, but it isn't an official Christian nation. However, culturally, we're definitely a Christian nation. The other thing is even though we have people here from who are African American or Asian American or like South American, well, that wouldn't make sense to be Colombian American or something. They do still have, we do have a shared cultural tradition, and that comes from Europe. If you don't believe me, think about Halloween. Halloween is definitely not a Christian holiday, but it is something that was brought over from Europe, and it continues to be something that Americans express. All right. Number 2, territory. Boundaries can change over time. They are not fixed and immutable. They can be changed by conquest. They can be changed by purchase or just through negotiation. So if you think about war, that's an easy one, right? The United States went to war with Great Britain for independence. We were successful, and so we go from being colonies to being our own country. You look at the United States buying Louisiana. We bought the Louisiana Purchase, right? That's purchase that the United States made from France. And then you have negotiation. So the Northwest Territory, which would be like Oregon and Washington State, like there wasn't a set boundary. And then the United States and Great Britain, they agreed upon a particular boundary, and that boundary has remained ever since. Now, it could change, but that's what we've gone with so far. Okay? Sovereignty. So states are equal to each other. That's what that means. So like the United States and Canada are both sovereign states. So we are both we both would view each other as being equals. Doesn't matter how small the country is, doesn't matter how big and powerful they are, they're still sovereign. Okay? A sovereign state gets to set its own foreign policy. So that's how it interacts with other countries. The United States, while it can try to interfere in other countries' foreign policy, if Mexico decides that it wants to normalize relations with Venezuela or Cuba or Russia or France, it can do so because it is a sovereign state. They can also decide what happens in their borders. Now, there is a little bit of limitation on sovereignty in the sense that you cannot kill your own people. If you do that, that's called, it could be genocide, and that is actionable by the international community. But if you think about it, the United States has the highest rates of incarceration of any of the Western industrialized nations. We can set our own laws. We can imprison as many people as we want. Whether or not you agree or disagree with that is a completely different topic. But what I'm telling you is that sovereignty means other countries can't tell you how to run your country. Okay? And then last, we have government, and that controls the actions and the policies of the state. So, is Michigan a state? Well, obviously it's a state, but I don't mean it in that sense. Do we have population? Yes. Do we have territory? Definitely. Do we have government? Yes. Do we have sovereignty? The answer to that is no. Michigan law is not above federal law because of Article 6, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, which clearly establishes that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Now, there are always issues that arise, such as, say, the Fugitive Slave Act back before the Civil War. That's federal law. Michigan refused to follow that law. Look at today, 2020. I think it was 2016 or 2018, the people of Michigan legalized recreational marijuana, and they also much earlier than that, legalized medical marijuana. Marijuana is a class 1 drug, which means at the federal level it is illegal, but Michigan has made it legal. So is it legal? At the federal level, no. At the state level, it is. So this is causing problems, and we'll talk about it, but not today. So what is a government? Well, first, they make laws. 2, they protect the state from outside attack. That would be the U.S. military, right? They keep order inside of the state. They help citizens by providing services like post offices, roads, schools, airports, healthcare, unemployment benefits. There's a whole great list of these things, okay? So who rules? So if only one person rules, this is called a monarchy. And it's usually a king or a queen, and usually they share power with the other parts of the government, and they're often subject to the country's constitution. Now, you can be a monarch and you can be an emperor. You can be a monarch and be a pharaoh. There are all kinds of different names, but essentially it's the same idea. You know, no matter, you're the monarch, you're the ruler, and it's hereditary. A dictatorship is an absolute control over citizens, the government, both the courts and the lawmaking body, and the Constitution itself. And that means that if things happen that you don't like, you control the courts, so you can close them down. If you don't like how the Constitution is written, you can just make adjustments on the fly. So, yeah. Nazi Germany is an example of a dictatorship. This is El Duce out of Italy, also an example of a dictatorship. An autocracy is a government in which one person has all the power. So you can be an autocratic ruler and be a monarch, or you could be an autocratic ruler and be a dictator. Okay? Now, in a democracy, citizens hold the political power, and I'm sure you're aware of this since you live in a representative democracy. But there's 2 kinds of democracy. We have direct and we have representative. We talked about this the other day when we talked about Rousseau. Rousseau believed that a direct democracy was the best form of government. You would have no representatives. Everybody would actually be involved in the day-to-day running of the government, and they would vote. And remember, if it's not unanimous, then it's just majority rules. Most countries, though, are just way too large for this form of government. I mean, like I told you the other day, I mean, the United States has 320 million people. There's not 320 million people that are like eligible to vote, but still, even if it's half the population, that's just enormous. So it's not a likely thing to be successful. Now, ancient Athens, as you just happen to be learning, is an example of a direct democracy, okay? And think of it this way. What ends up happening to Athens? Representative democracy is where citizens elect leaders to represent their rights and their interests in government. These elected representatives, they do the day-to-day work of governing, and they can also be voted out of office by the citizens. Then we have rule by a few. It's called an oligarchy. So this is when you have a small group of people that have all of the power. It's usually elites. It's ruled by minority rather than majority. And this is called a junta. It's a military version of an oligarchy. So like here's some generals. So if a general or the army overthrows a government and establishes itself as having the power and the authority, that's a junta is what it's called. Then we have a theocracy. And this is a government that recognizes God or a divine being as being the ultimate source of authority. And it can be a democracy, it can be a dictatorship, it can be a monarchy, or almost any other kind of government. Some famous examples are the Catholic Church. Iran is also a theocracy. There are other examples as well. And then you have rule by none. This is anarchy. No one or everyone is in control, depending on how you look at it. And it would be an accurate description of the state of nature, and no country has this as their form of government and wants it. Okay? There are places on the planet that are in a state of anarchy, like take Lebanon after the port explosion, when the government can't really do anything. No one is in charge, meaning everyone is in charge, right? How do you limit the government? All right, so how we limit government here in the United States is we have a constitution. And what the Constitution essentially is it's the rule book for how our country's government is going to be formed and how it operates and what it can and what it can't do. So it explains what kind of government the country has. So like in the United States version, it's a republic. It tells how a country's laws are made. Okay, so it literally will tell you that the Constitution is the highest law in the land, and that the legislative branch of our three parts of our government makes the laws. It's going to explain the rights and the responsibilities of the citizens. And then in most modern countries, they have written constitutions. Another way to limit government is by rule of law. The laws have to be fair. The laws have to be enforceable. And the laws have to be followed by everybody, not just some people, but everybody. So there are procedures in place to make sure that law is enforced, and when it's not, we have a court system to correct that. By the way, this is what the Supreme Court looks like in Washington, D.C. All right, what's another way we can limit government? Well, you can separate the powers. So divided government, you can divide the government into several branches. So like in the United States, we have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. Some countries have an executive and a legislative branch, and then some have judicial as well, but this is common as well. But no matter what, they don't just allow for one branch of government. They make sure that no one person or part of the government has too much control, and then that how they do that is each branch can check the other branch. So like Congress passes law, but the president has to sign into law. If the president vetoes the law, the legislative branch can override his veto. If the legislative branch passes a law, the judicial branch can declare it to be unconstitutional. The legislative branch can counter that, though, by amending the Constitution. Okay? There you go. We'll get into all that stuff later. Each branch has its own responsibility and its own function, and it is equal to the other branches of government. Consent of the governed. So citizens freely give their permission to be governed by a country's government, and they do this by voting, and voting is what legitimizes a government. And government can actually change through voting, because prior to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, we had a Democratic president. Now we have a Republican president. We have an election coming up in November, and then we'll see what happens. We'll either continue with the Republican government that we have, or it could be a divided government, or it could be a Democratic government. We'll see. And the other thing is you and I can change the Constitution. We can vote to amend it, and that's a way for us to limit the government, and is also how we demonstrate consent of the governed. The rights of the minority. So protecting the rights of a small or an unpopular group from the majority is important in limiting the government's power. Everybody has to be treated fairly. If you look at like the 14th Amendment, you have what's called the Due Process Clause. And what that means is that before the law, everyone is to be treated equally. So you can't discriminate against people based on their age, their gender, their sexual orientation, their ethnic background, their religious background, what culture they belong to, all these things. Okay, so we have what are called minority rights. Again, I don't mean minority in the sense of like your skin color, although that would be part of this perhaps, but that's not all I'm talking about. Then we have the rule of law. So the rule of law means that people do not make law. Okay, the Constitution makes the law, and then people have to carry out the law, the jurists or the judges. So laws are what run this country. It's not the opinion of people. It's not how much money you have. It's not if you're stronger than somebody or scarier than somebody that you get your way. The law is what rules in the United States. Okay, one of the most important cases happened in 1803. This is very early into our republic's existence, where we have Marbury versus Madison, and it's arguably the most important Supreme Court case in history. The decision that was made by the court is that, in this case, is that the courts have what is called judicial review. You will not find these words anywhere in the Constitution, but what it is it grants the judicial branch the power of the federal courts to make void, meaning cancel out, declare unconstitutional acts of Congress or the president. Okay, so what this did was it established a check and balance in the federal system overall. Because honestly, when you guys see next week, when we look at the Constitution, the Constitution is very, very vague about what is the role of the Supreme Court itself. And so the Supreme Court established judicial review through Marbury versus Madison. This isn't like a new thing, but it's not in the Constitution expressly. It is in the Federalist Papers, which we'll talk about next week. All right, so we're still talking about rule of law. So rule of law is about rule of law, of course, but it's also about order, security. It's about legitimacy, and it's about checks and balances. So what is order and security? Well, citizens have to feel safe during their daily activities, meaning going to work, walking in the streets, sending their kids to school, in their place of employment. And then police have procedures to deal with crime. So if there's a murder and someone's, you call the police, an investigation needs to be taken, statements need to be made, arrests will be made, hopefully at some point, and then there's a whole other system involved after that. Criminals have to face consequences, and they'll do that by facing a judge and a jury, and if found guilty, they will be justice will be administered accordingly. Legitimacy is that citizens have to see the law as worthy of being followed, and citizens have to have input in the lawmaking process, and we have this by voting for representatives, because our representatives make laws. And then citizens need to respect the law and then see laws as fair. This right here is honestly what part of the whole Black Lives Matter issue is that we have segments of our population which see the laws as they are written as not being worthy of being followed because it's resulting in the deaths of a particular group of people. And because they are marginalized in the political process, they don't have a lot of input in the lawmaking process. And because of this, they don't have respect for not only the law, but those that carry out the law, the police. And they see the laws not as being fair, but as being unfair because they target a select group of people in a way that the majority doesn't encounter. Okay, that's my best attempt at avoiding that, that minefield there. We'll get into that later, but not today. All right, checks and balances. So power is divided among the branches of government, and all branches function effectively, and the judicial system has to be independent from the other branches, meaning it can't require, or it can't rely on its powers to come from either of the other two branches. It has to be able to stand on its own leg. So how we have this is, or how this is brought into being, is these people, once they're appointed and approved to the judicial system, whether they are on the Supreme Court or just any federal court, they serve for life. They can be removed if they do something wrong, like they can be impeached, but they are removed from the political process. And then lastly is elected officials have to be able to answer to the people. And what that means is, in the next election, if people are unhappy with what you've done, you can be voted out of office. So but we have equal application of the law. So nobody is above the law, not even elected officials. And I love this picture. This is John Lewis. Unfortunately, he passed away this year. He walked with Dr. Martin Luther King. He spoke at the March on Washington. He's led his whole life has been about, social justice, civil rights, equality. And here he is. He was protesting immigration reform. This is in 2013, and he was here he is being arrested by the Capitol Police. Of course, he's going to make bond, but the idea though is, even though he is a member of the House of Representatives, he's being civilly disobedient. He's asked to disperse. He refuses, so he's arrested. Okay. The judicial system has to treat everybody the same. That's why justice, like the statue, is got a blindfold. Justice is supposed to be blind. And again, if you look at the issues that are being brought up with the protests of Black Lives Matter, that's not how a fairly substantial segment of the population does not agree that justice is blind. Procedural fairness, the government has rules for legal proceedings. So, for example, when you are stopped by the police, they have to tell you why they're stopping you. If you're being arrested, you need to be told why you're being arrested. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to quick and speedy trial. There are all kinds of rules that have to be that are put in place and have to be followed. And the government has to actually follow those rules. Okay, if it doesn't follow those rules, or if it follows those rules for one segment of the population and not the other, this is going to cause problems. And then the rules for legislating or for legal proceedings, they have to be fair. Access to justice, citizens have a way to enforce their rights, meaning access to justice means that if somebody does something to you, like maybe they throw a rock at your car and they do damage to it, you need a way to be able to redress this grievance. So you need to be able to do something, and that something is you can sue them. You can sue them for damages. You can call the police and have that person that you saw, or maybe you have on your phone, like the camera, doing damage to your property. You can show this to the police and then have them be arrested. Citizens have the knowledge that they need to get justice. This one's a little bit tricky because some people's understanding of what justice is based on TV shows that they watch. It's not based on reality, let's say. And I'll give you a quick example. So there was a woman who had her dog in New York Central Park. She didn't have it on a leash. A black man who was a birder, meaning he was looking at birds, asked her to put the dog on a leash. She refused. She got irate. She called the police. Well, okay, her idea was because somebody told her to do something she didn't want, the responsible thing to do was to call the police. This woman lacked knowledge. Okay, the justice system is available for people to use, and it is. Like, if you have problems, you can call the police. I know this is oversimplified, and we will definitely get into the reality of all this, but this is how it's supposed to work. Okay, that's what I have for you today. Now, tomorrow you are going to have a test, or I'm going to release that test to you, and I was going to show you it, not the whole test, but just a little bit of it. So it's multiple choice. Okay, there's no A, B, C, D, and it's not huge. You can definitely do it. I don't think you're going to have any problems. Okay, so breathe, relax. On Friday, you can ask me whatever you want to ask me in the 55 minutes that we have together. I still have other things I want to do, but like, you are prepared. You just have to be calm. Okay, you have to remember to take it before you go to sleep on Sunday night, but it'll be fine. I'm not going to give it to you tonight. I changed my mind. I'm going to give it to you Friday after we're out of school, so you can exhale. Okay, you're going to be fine. What you should do if you're done with this Foundations of Government review, as I'm calling it, is you should have a large compilation of notes at this point. Okay, make sure that you have those notes. You should have key terms on one side, definitions on the other. Make connections, okay, between like the different philosophers and then what their contributions were. Today, right now rather, this is fairly substantial what I've just given you. It's quite a bit of new information, but honestly, unless I don't even really know what to say, because like, if you don't know that the state has population, territory, and government, like sovereignty is the only new word, that this shouldn't be too big of a problem for you. I'm thinking, right? And then you have sovereignty as a definition down, and it says the ultimate authority. Okay, so that just fits in here really nicely. All right. And then government. If you don't know the government makes laws, I mean, really? And then they protect the state from outside attack. That's what the military is. Remember, that's what I was in. And don't say I was in the Army, because I wasn't in the Army. I was in the Navy. Are these the only benefits or services that are provided by the government? No, of course there's lots more, okay? Who rules? I mean, you guys know from world history that monarchy is the most dominant form of government that we've ever had, right? So you know about dictatorships. You had U.S. history last year. We talked about direct democracy with Rousseau, and you know that we live in a representative democracy or a republic because you told me this the other day, all right? I don't remember who it was exactly in class, but when I asked you what is ruled by a few, you know it was oligarchy. Theocracy, that might be new for you, but like many of you are religious, I'm going to assume that substantial, maybe not substantial, but a portion of you are going to be Catholic. So theocracy, it's not that hard. And then anarchy, okay? I have seen this spray painted in many places here in Flint. Anarchy, no rule, okay? Limiting government, Constitution, rule of law, separation of power, consent of the governed, rights of the minority. Okay, we talked about this before. We talked about this before. We talked about this before. Remember, that was Montesquieu. Rule of law, also Montesquieu. Constitution, also known as a social contract. Okay, there's lots of stuff here, but like this is not new stuff. It's just stuff that we had that's built upon. Okay. Rule of law, order of society, security, sorry, legitimacy, checks and balances. This stuff is new. Not the rule of law so much, but the rule of law part, I've added Marbury versus Madison. Okay. Marbury versus Madison is a case that I will go over repeatedly in this class, whenever, especially when I'm talking about the Supreme Court or just the federal courts overall. Just connect in your mind the following words: Marbury versus Madison, judicial review. All right. Order of security. I mean, think about it. That's what the law is supposed to provide for you. Legitimacy. That means that, well, you know what the word legitimacy means. So apply that, but now to the system of laws. Checks and balances. We've talked about this before. And that's also would be Montesquieu. Equal application of the law. This one we haven't talked about in class, but I mean, I think you should know that that's like how the law is supposed to work. I mean, does it actually work that way? That's up for debate, but still, that's a different story. And then procedural fairness. If you've ever watched any kind of cop show or Law and Order or any of those things, there is a procedure. Just look at what the words are. Procedural fairness is the way that the execution or the carrying out of the law, is it fair? And then access to justice. The United States, here in the United States, we love to sue each other. And so that's part of what access to justice is. If you need help, I will be here on Friday. You can ask me anything you need to. You are not going to have the test on today. Yeah, well, for you, that's today. And then during Friday. Okay? All right. See you guys and gals and anyone in between.